Today, we'll be discussing giants. But not the fee-fi-fo-fum kind. No, today we will be covering the possibility that giants may have actually existed. Now, we definitely know that some human beings are born with giantism. This is caused by adenoma. This is a tumour of the pituitary gland. Giantism occurs in people who had an excess of the growth hormone in childhood. According to the Guinness World Records, the tallest man ever to be recorded was a Mr. Robert Wadlow. Robert Wadlow was last measured on June the 27th, 1940. He was 2.72 metres, or 8 foot 11.1 inches tall, and he still remains the tallest person in the world. Unfortunately, 18 days after his measurement, Robert Wadlow passed away. Now, when I think of people with giantism, I can't help but think of Andrei René Roussimoff, or you may know him by his show name, Andre the Giant. Born in 1946 in Grenoble, in France, Andre was born with giantism and put his magnificent size to good use and became a wrestler. His size was a massive 7 foot 4 inches and weighed 500 pounds. He was probably best known for his part in the WWF wrestling, now known as WWE. But for me, I was first blown away by his screen appearance in the Princess Bride movie. In the movie, he played Fezzik, the friendly but intimidating giant. I remember seeing him on screen for the first time. The sheer size amazed me, and how he towered over the rest of the cast, including Cary Elwes, who played the mysterious Man in Black. When the two actors shared a scene, you could clearly see the size difference. Andre's head seemed to be twice the size of Cary Elwes's, and Andre's massive hands seemed like they could easily have crushed the Man in Black's skull, or so it seemed. But all that being said, today's episode will focus on the possibility that some mythological giants, biblical giants, and some long-lost tribes and races of giants may in fact have been real. First giant, who comes from one of the most famous giant stories ever told, and I don't mean the one featuring the beanstalk, although stay tuned because that one will be mentioned later on in the episode. I mean Goliath, from the biblical story David and Goliath. David was a simple shepherd. Being the youngest of 8 brothers, he was given the job to tend the family's livestock, the sheep, whilst his brothers fought in a battle which was at a stalemate between the Israelites and the Philistines. The Philistines being the opposing army. The Israelite army was led by King Saul, and the outcome was not looking good. For the past 40 days, every morning, one of the Philistines repeatedly stepped out on the field between the two armies and challenged anyone in the Israelite army to fight him. If he won, the battle would then be won by the Philistines. But if the Israelite army fighter won, then the Philistine army would accept defeat and leave. Now the problem was the Philistine champion stood over 9 feet tall and seemed to block out the sun with his impressive size. He wore thick armour and wielded the biggest sword anyone had ever seen. He was truly gigantic and a terror to look upon, and he knew it. Goliath was his name. Every day he stepped out onto the field and presented his challenge, but no one ever accepted, not even King Saul. One day David was given the job by his father to take his brothers, who were on the battlefield, their lunch. When David arrived, David was mocked, as usual, for not being a fighter, and was told to go and tend his flock. As he was leaving, he noticed the huge Philistine, Goliath, step into the field and begin to challenge the Israelites to a single combat fight. David could see how intimidated the Israelites were, as Goliath towered over them like a mountain. David didn't like this, and to everyone's amazement, he accepted the challenge. Goliath looked down in amazement at the small shepherd boy and began to laugh at the boy's small stature and weak appearance. Goliath wanted to fight a more worthy opponent, but nevertheless, he accepted the challenge. Meanwhile, David's brothers were furious. that he had doomed them all, and the king was also not impressed. But David believed he had the power of God on his side, and he managed to persuade the king that with God's help, he couldn't lose. King Saul insisted that David be dressed in the king's very own armour. When David tried on the armour, it just fell off his body or hung from his limbs. It was far too big. So David decided he would prefer to fight in nothing but his shepherd's robes. His weapon of choice was a simple slingshot with a single stone. On the day of battle, Goliath stepped out onto the field. His armour he wore looked thick and impenetrable. He pointed his sword at David and shouted at him, telling him he was going to feed his corpse to the birds. David simply loaded his sling with a single stone and began to swing it above his head, each swing picking up more momentum. Then Goliath charged at David, his sword drawn, ready to strike. The ground seemed to shake as he approached the small boy, swinging a single stone. As Goliath drew closer, David released the sling, sending it flying through the air with a bone-cracking sound when it collided with Goliath's forehead. The giant crashed to the ground with immense force as the armies gazed in disbelief. David walked over and lifted Goliath's massive sword over his head and brought it down in a single swing, separating Goliath's head from his body, and the Philistines retreated in fear. And just like that, David had won the war for the Israelites, and eventually would become king himself. Now, many believe that this part of the Bible is pure myth, but there are a few that believe the opposite, that Goliath did indeed exist. After all, there is a lot of evidence that King David was real, so why not Goliath? An archaeological dig in Israel may hold a relevant clue to the history and existence of the giant Goliath. A small ceramic shard has been discovered at Tel Asafi, the site of the biblical city. The shard holds one of the earliest ever Philistine inscriptions ever discovered. The inscription mentions two names, which are both amazingly similar to the name Goliath, and the icing on the cake is that the city of Gath is said to be Goliath's hometown. This evidence is remarkable, but admittedly, the chance that this is the same Goliath as in the story is slim. And the name Goliath was a very popular name around the time that the shard was dated back to, some 50 years after the story of David and Goliath was said to have taken place. Although many do believe that this is exceptional evidence, that maybe Goliath was more than myth. There is more evidence on the possible existence of Goliath, although I must admit it is few and far between. Ancient Philistine burial grounds have also been unearthed, giving light on the culture of the Philistines. Artifacts and many other trinkets were also found that one day may shed a bit more light on the subject. There is another theory, that 2 miles from where the fight supposedly took place, there is an 80-foot overgrown mound of earth that some believe may be the final resting place of Goliath. Although the mound has never been inspected, so at the moment it's nothing more but speculation. Although it is important to note that these burial mounds have been found all around the world, with reputable sources saying that giant remains were found in them. Although, as you will see in this episode as we progress, a lot of the evidence and the remains that people have said to have seen with their own eyes does seem, for some reason, to just disappear from all public records, never to be seen again. And next on my list, which is in no particular order at all, is the mystery of the legendary red-haired giants of Lovelock Cave. There is a cave in North America, a bat cave you could say, although it's not the one where Batman parks his car. No, this cave has had many different names. Sunset Guano Cave, Horseshoe Cave, but the name you're most likely to be familiar with is Lovelock Cave. The cave is about 150 feet long and 35 feet wide, and is said to have housed an ancient race of red-haired giants. The cave has been used to gather bat guano, bat droppings, since 1911, and since that time, many archaeological artifacts have been discovered. including 11 duck decoy models. These model ducks were made out of a grass-like herb and was then painted and feathered. Also, many animal traps were found. Also, a hand-woven sling was discovered in 1912, which experts believe belonged to a tribe of ancient Indians, and was most likely used for hunting birds, or possibly used as a child's toy. Traps, nets, and baskets were also found in Lovelock Cave, which strongly indicate the cave was indeed lived in. Just outside of the cave, there is a lake, now named Humboldt's Sink, a dried out remnant of a once larger prehistoric lake. This was called Lake Lahontan, which existed roughly 13,000 years ago. This would have been perfect for the many inhabitants of the caves over the hundreds of years, providing fresh water and fresh fish, and explains the ancient nets and duck decoy models that have been aged at around 2,000 years old, along with many more artifacts, including a very large sandal that was over 15 inches in size, and it is believed that the cave has been utilised since 2580 BC. But is it possible that human beings are not the only inhabitants of the cave? Is it possible there was a time when giants may have lived in the cave and all evidence has been lost from history or taken away? According to a tribe of Native Americans, there was once a race of red-haired giants that did indeed live in Lovelock Cave, and this has all been documented by Sarah Winnemucca Hopkins, who was the daughter of the Paiutes Indian chief. It was all written down in 1882 in her book Life Among the Paiutes, The Wrongs and Claims. In her book, she describes the so-called giants to have been vicious, unfriendly, and had a cannibalistic nature. According to her story, the tribe of Indians chased down the last of the remaining tribe of the red-haired giants into Lovelock Cave. The Indians demanded that the giants come out and fight, but the giants refused. The Indians proceeded to shoot arrows into the cave, then started a fire at the entrance. The smoke drove out a few of the giants, which were shot dead with arrows, whilst the others simply burned to death inside the cave. Over time, the entrance was said to have collapsed, and its only inhabitants were the bats. Sarah claims that her story is factual, and it was all passed on down generation and generation of her family. As mentioned before, since the initial mining for guano in 1911, many more digs took place in the following years. In 1924, a dig was completed on the cave, and in 1929, a report was published. Approximately 10,000 artifacts were found. These include some items I previously mentioned: tools, baskets, and weapons, and of course the duck decoys, which are said to be the oldest known in the world, and 60 average height mummies were unearthed. That's average height mummies. And whilst this is a very, very impressive find, they're not giant. So what documentation do we have of giant fossils actually being found in Lovelock Cave? Well, apparently there was another report that claimed the remains of the red-haired giants were found during the initial dig. There were reports of 2 red-haired giants that were found. One a male, over 8 feet tall, and the other female, 6.5 feet tall. However, no evidence such as documentation, or more importantly, the remains of the red-haired giants, no longer exist. That is, if they ever did. In 1931, an article was published in the Nevada Review Minor. It was reported that another 2 skeletons were found in the Humboldt Dry Lake bed, near Lovelock, Nevada. One was said to have been measured at 8.5 feet tall and wrapped similar to Egyptian mummies, and the other measured nearly 10 feet tall. Other evidence for the giant's existence includes a handprint imprinted on the boulder in the cave, twice the size of a human hand. Many of the artifacts found in the caves can be viewed in many museums, but unfortunately, the whereabouts of the red-haired giants remains a mystery. Now, Think back to when you was a child. What was the first story you heard involving giants? I'm guessing it was Jack and the Beanstalk. The story of Jack trading his cow for magic beans, which results in a beanstalk reaching the clouds where a giant lives. Did you know that this classic children's tale was actually a transformation of a more brutal story or stories from an earlier period? Yes, Jack and the Beanstalk is actually a toned down version of the many chronicles of Jack the Giant Killer. These violent tales tell of Jack on his many adventures travelling around Britain, slaying giants wherever he found them. Now it is worth mentioning that there are many ancient stories that the first inhabitants of Britain were actually giants, although this is hard to find strong evidence. Jack the Giant Slayer's most popular tale to be told was the one of him defeating the giant, Cormoran. The story goes that Jack defeated Cormoran on St. Michael's Mount in Cornwall. Jack blew his horn as loud as he could, which caught the giant's attention, and the giant rushed towards Jack. Unfortunately for the giant, Jack had set a trap. He had dug a hole and covered it with twigs. The giant fell into the pit and became stuck. Jack then grabbed his pickaxe and drove it down upon the giant, hacking him to death. And why is this story relevant? Well, it just so happens that once again, a skeleton has been reported to have been found. A very big skeleton. It was supposedly found in the same location the tale was set. Roughly 250 years ago at St. Michael's Mount, a skeleton was dug up in the dungeon of the island. It measured just over 8 foot, and many believe this is a giant that Jack slayed. It was noted in the annual register of 1761, a miner accidentally found a stone coffin. Inside the coffin was the remains of a man of gigantic size. But as the skeleton was so old, it apparently turned to dust as soon as the earth made contact, and the only thing to remain was a large tooth, 2.5 inches long. The coffin was over 11 feet 3 inches, and its depth was 3 feet 9 inches. In the 1955 news report, it was stated that St. Michael's Mount was given to the British National Trust to be preserved as a historical site and a tourist destination, where the public can go and see the so-called resting place of Cormoran the Giant. And it is said that on some nights when the moon shines bright, the giant's ghost can be heard moaning from beneath the stones of his cold grave. And next on our list, we have the San Diego Giant, which was first reported in 1895. Now this one, I'll tell you, is believed to be a hoax, but there are some strange elements to its story. It was reported in 1895 that an 8 foot 4 inch tall giant was discovered by prospectors. Some said it was the remains of an unknown race, whilst others claimed it was a very large Native American. In 1896, the giant was believed to have been bought by a deputy marshal named Fred Rawson, who placed the remains on display, charging people to see the exhibit. And there it stayed for about 12 years, when in 1908, the Smithsonian Museum became interested in the mummy. Before they offered money, they apparently took a sample of the mummy's skin, and Rawson agreed to this. The Smithsonian purchased the mummy for $500. Now remember, this was in 1908, so in today's money, you're looking at maybe over $14,000. Not long after, the mummy was declared a hoax. The Smithsonian Museum claimed the mummy was made from a gelatin, and there was nothing more than a sideshow attraction. Now this is where people start to get a bit suspect. If this was true, then how can you explain how the Smithsonian Museum missed this when the mummy was looked over years before by experts, and they failed to see any resemblance to gelatin? Also, why would the Smithsonian Museum spend so much money on the mummy without first proving, without a shadow of a doubt, the authenticity of the giant's remains? And many say that they seemed overly keen to get the giant in their possession. And just like that, As soon as a mummy was so-called exposed to be a fake, it simply vanished from public eye. There are no records that now exist of the mummy's existence, apart from a photograph that may or may not be real. Now, there are also many theories that giants built some of the world's most ancient structures, as well as theories that aliens built these structures, and many other different theories are out there too. But today we'll be focusing on the giant side, and maybe one day in a different episode we'll come back to this. First of all, let's take the ancient Egyptian pyramids and how the stone was perfectly cut. I mean, these stones were absolutely massive and weighed up to 15 tons per piece. Over the course of 20 years, it was said that 20,000 workers built the pyramids. But many people struggle with the thought that mere men could get these enormous blocks so high upon the structure. And many say it just isn't possible in those times to achieve such a feat. I don't know, maybe we don't give the human race enough credit. Isn't it possible the ancient Egyptians were more than capable of building these amazing, seemingly impossible structures? Well, actually many think not. When you examine the many hieroglyphics which have been left by the ancient Egyptians, depicting the workers of a much greater size than any other Egyptian. I mean, the workers in the hieroglyphics seem to just tower over the other Egyptians in the pictures. However, some believe that the taller figures in the paintings represent a higher class of a person, rather than them being of gigantic size, and it's not to be taken literally. But then again, many of the hieroglyphics show the incredibly tall Egyptians lifting enormous rocks and wielding building tools. I mean, so can you really rule out that it isn't impossible that there was an early race of Egyptians? Giant Egyptians. And now as we move across the world and we go to Stonehenge, now I could easily do a whole episode on the mysteries of Stonehenge, but today I'm going to concentrate on the sheer size of the rocks and how it would seem impossible for humans to have built it. And once again, giants are introduced as an explanation. Some of the rocks weigh up to 60 tons, and it is generally believed that the large stones in Salisbury in England were transported one by one from Wales. Now, many believe this is an impossibility and could only have been achieved by an advanced race. A race of giants? One theory is that the mythical character Merlin helped build Stonehenge, but he didn't do it alone. It is said that he had help from an African giant. Now, I know what you're thinking. Merlin is a work of fiction, the wizard from the fictional King Arthur series. Or were they fictional? There has been many investigations to the possibility of the existence of Camelot and Arthur. But what we do know is that Merlin may have actually existed. He may have existed as two separate men whose life stories were combined to make the Merlin character, who first appeared on page in 1136. In one of the many stories of Merlin, it is said that Merlin built Stonehenge using huge stones that were brought by a giant to create a stone circle monument in Ireland, the Ring of Killarus, and with the help of his magic, the stones were brought to Salisbury. An image from the book shows Merlin and another man, as well as a massive giant, either building Stonehenge or possibly dismantling the stones in Ireland, ready for transportation back to Salisbury. And if all that sounds a little far-fetched, I'd like to hear your opinion on the following. It has been recently suggested that Stonehenge and its construction actually predates human beings, suggesting that Stonehenge existed long before human beings ever laid eyes on it. And it is entirely possible that Stonehenge is nothing more but one of nature's natural occurrences. Although, it is hard to accept this, when Stonehenge famously aligns with the summer solstice, and seems to be some kind of prehistoric calendar. So if this structure was built prior to human beings being around, let alone a so-called fictional character, is it possible that a race of giants built this amazing structure for reasons lost to time? So what do you think? Did giants once walk the earth? Or do they just belong in fairy tales and mythology? Me? Like always, I like to keep an open mind. You must admit that there does seem to be a conspiracy angle around the subject. It would seem that if giants did once exist, somebody doesn't want us to know about it. But as always, I'll let you decide. Take care. I'll see you next time.